Hello and welcome to ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environmental, social, and governance. I'm your host, Ernest Anunciacion. For today's episode, we're talking about building governance, risk, and compliance within your ESG programs and reporting. And our guest is an expert on this topic. Dina Trainor is a managing director at Deloitte, and she specializes in helping organizations implement new accounting and regulatory reporting regulations. She joined us at Amplify 2023 and led a fantastic roundtable discussion about building controls into the ESG reporting process. Dina, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ernest. Happy to be here.
All right, let's dive right in. ESG reporting is becoming more important, but there's still a lot of people that are pretty insecure about it. In fact, there was a recent Deloitte poll that found that less than half of professionals, I think it was 47 or 45.7%, say that they are confident in their organization's ability in the financial reporting teams to gather and report on ESG metrics for regulatory compliance purposes. Clearly, companies have to act now in order to build trust in ESG reporting. So, Dina, my question to you is, why is it so important for organizations to factor in governance, risk, and controls when they're constructing their reports?
Without going into the whole history, if we think about the evolution of sustainability and reporting, it really started with small sustainability teams within an organization. And once the regulators really got involved and started pushing out a lot of the proposed rules and now finalized rules, finance, and when I say finance across the board, which meaning your CFO's direct reports, internal audit, controllership, FP&A, treasury, tax, said, wait a minute, we should really understand what we're disclosing, and not necessarily for a regulation perspective, but and everywhere. Because now I've got a risk to my brand. I've got a reputation risk. I've got customers that are reconciling between a regulatory disclosure and what I'm putting on my website. And so how do I get my arms around that? Well, that's an organizational wide change, which means our governance structure would have to change too, right? We want people to be informed. We want additional folks and capabilities and responsibilities so that the company feels comfortable that what we put out there is at a decreased risk for our brand and for our stakeholders and for our business and for the fear of getting canceled. If I had to, relate to some of the younger generations.
Okay, let's break down some of these areas, starting with governance. How should organizations create an effective governance framework and a culture that supports effective ESG reporting?
Yeah, so it really, I would say, starts from the board, the audit committee, nominating committee, and having not only folks that understand what sustainability is, what some of the ESG KPIs and metrics are at the board level, but starting to ask management of the questions of what are you doing with it? How does this impact our strategy? So when you go down from the board down to steering committees, having a cross-functional representation and having a seat at the table in that cross-functional representation at the steering committee level. And then disseminating really down to the working groups. It all comes down to does my organization speak the same language when it comes to sustainability? Do we define KPIs similar? Do we define definitions the same? And once we do, and once we start talking the same language and being able to truly collaborate across the organization, that governance structure not only gets stronger, but we also have the impact to risk, and that's to decrease it.
Right on. And I think about this as setting the tone from the top. So, Dina, how are corporate boards changing and why does it matter for sustainability efforts and resource allocations across different companies?
Well, I mean, I don't have the percentages of, how many board members are sustainability literate, right? But what I will say is what we're seeing is an evolution. Boards are diversifying, not only diversifying from a D&I perspective, but diversifying from even a capabilities perspective and a knowledge perspective, because it is important to many organizations. And having a board that supports it, like you said, it sets that tone right at the top. And, with the goal of it disseminates down throughout the organization as well. While some people might not love that, right? Because it's more things on their plate, more things to do. And, number one question is like, I don't have enough resources because I have all these other priorities, right? That's a whole nother topic, and an area where, I know a lot of companies are exploring of how do I get the right resourcing to help.
Absolutely. And so I guess a follow up question to that, Dina, is why is it important for finance teams to have a seat at the table when it comes to ESG?
So yes, so that's the short answer. The long answer is there's, I think, different levels of involvement when we think about seat at the table. The sustainability organization, wherever they report up to, clearly a responsible and accountable team member. Finance probably was informed before, but the evolution of the finance organization moving into having a seat at the table and influence has gone up. So the CFO, 100%, right? Nothing's 100%. We'll call it the CFO. The external reporting, that organization, internal audit, the CAE typically has a direct report right to the board, and so it's super important that the internal audit is understanding what the organization has historically done around sustainability reporting and the data, and how they can be influencers around it as well. They don't have to be the cops, but they should be the influencers and say, have you thought about, let's consider uplifting our controls, enhancing our controls. So kind of a convoluted answer, but CFO having a seat at the table. Of the direct reports, I would say the ones maybe in the near term would be either your chief audit executive, your corporate controller, external reporting. And that's not to say that treasury and tax shouldn't be involved, but the level of maybe where they are at the seat of the table could be the next.
Right, Dina. And I think about ESG program as a form of risk management. So, what are some of the key questions that organizations should start to ask when assessing those types of risks across the enterprise?
Tactically, I would even say, relook at what your risk framework is today. And when you think about what's included in your risk framework, have you included those questions that are broader sustainability related questions? Meaning, if there is a hurricane and we are located in Florida and wipe out half our data centers, for example, there's a risk to the business, but then we're also thinking about, well, the environmental risk of those hurricanes as well, right? Also, how do we come across as an organization from a D&I perspective, but also social inclusion perspective? How are we investing our money? Where are we building our buildings? How are we supporting a diverse set of practices, but also a diverse set of people and capabilities as well? So it's a broad risk category. And I mean, if you look at anybody's financial statements, we list out a bunch of risks, right? From a financial statement perspective, how do we connect those risks to the broader environmental risks, to our broader social and our governance risks, and then really kind of enhance our risk framework? And then trickling it down to, okay, so now we've enhanced our risk framework. What controls exist? What controls don't? How do we enhance those? So, Ernest, back to your previous role as a CAE and an influencer, I do think that's important, right? Because where you do have an independence type role, there is a role to be an advisor around this as well.
How do you decide between frequent business travel and adopting sustainability practices? You have to consider both the financial as well as the environmental aspects, including the different costs and the risks.
Yeah, and maybe I'll add to that is you got to think about the cost of the risk as well. And what I mean by that is, at a company where we travel a lot, which I'm sure you all can relate to as well, what is the cost of us traveling versus the risk of us not traveling and continuing the business that we are, right? And when you think about that from a carbon emissions factor, there's a weight in optionality as well on how to continue as a successful business, but also incorporating sustainable practices. And what's the cost involved with that too? So there is that as well.
Awesome. So let's move on to controls now. As an external auditor, Deloitte is called on by clients to assess processes and controls within ESG reporting. Do companies have enough controls in place to produce accurate reporting? And what do you think they have to do in order to get ready for third party assurance over their ESG data?
Yeah, so this is where I go back to the definitions, right? Because earlier on, if you talk to a sustainability organization, they say, yeah, we've got controls around this. Somebody reviews it, it goes into this share file that gets reviewed by X, Y, and Z, and it goes into our report. If you ask a auditor or a financial reporting person or internal audit person, if that's the level of controls that we would find would meet our needs, at times we might say no, right? Now, that's to say, we can't go in and be bad cops and say, this has got to be SOX level controls and you've got to have a signature in every single piece of paper and this has to be this and this. Like, that's not the answer either. There is a balance between thinking in a SOX like manner and applying to the process from the data source all the way through report that makes sense for the organization and helps reduce the risk. That's really where we see this playing out. And there's also going to be controls that are already developed. And finance was like, oh, well, maybe can we just incorporate this control over the whole reporting process? Sure, because now that reporting process may go into finance more, right? So there's like shifts and balances, but to upskill and up level, we'll call it, controls, I do think is important in educating your facility manager who before would get his fuel bills from his cousin Bill in an email of why that may not be the right level of control that we need, because this is data now that's being relied on and audited. So it's really comes down to a lot of the education as well.
So to follow up on that, Dina, how can external and internal audit teams work together? I think about them bringing transparency, accountability, and accuracy into that reporting. How do you think external auditors think about ESG versus how internal audit is thinking about ESG?
So maybe clarify that question when you say, how are they thinking differently or the same? Because I think we're all moving towards a understanding of what sustainability truly means to an organization, what KPIs, what the regulators are saying, internal or external. And in my mind, internal audit is prepping the company for the external audit, right? So in a perfect world, internal audit, as part of the audit program, says, here's what we found, here's, where we need to fix. And then the external auditors come in and everything's perfect, right? That's again in a utopian world. But if we think about the teams and the way we're thinking should be the same ultimately, right?
Right.
And maybe what I'll add though is because there's a whole operational aspect to internal audit, that's not just financial metrics focused. There's an opportunity for the operational side also to enhance kind of what the process looks like, how it's documenting, and how we can decrease risk on it, on the operational side. So, if we're looking at different real estate options, or if we're building a new building, right? And there's, sustainable products we could be using, or, contractors that have more sustainable practices versus others, and kind of looking at that sense as well, where maybe the financial statement auditors wouldn't be looking at to that level, but from an operational perspective, thinking from the operational lens as well.
Now, data collection to support ESG efforts is probably the biggest challenge that companies are facing, as reported by more than a quarter of the respondents in that poll. I think it was 26.3%. So, how does technology then help organizations enhance controls around that data collection process, as well as the input and the report build out?
I would start with the data readiness before we go to technology. Now, technology can enhance how fast we ingest the data. It can enhance the controls around the information, it being into a shared area, who has access to it, how the data flows. But the old term of garbage in, garbage out really applies here too. And if you put technology over a broken process, and again, like these general things apply completely here and apply even more because a lot of the data is manual. It's non-financial data. It's information that has not maybe been collected in the way that will need to be collected in the future. So there's technologies across all, from the data source, saying to data management, to data collection and reporting, to analytics and insights. So technology is a huge play, but you've got to understand the data readiness piece of it for the technology to really be successful, versus clients say, oh, I put a technology over this and it still sucks. Well, I'm sorry, did you look at what you're putting in there? Or the outputs that are coming out? So, yeah.
Another interesting fact coming from the poll is that it found that professionals from organizations that have an ESG controller in place are more likely to report data collection as their top challenge. And that was around 39.6%. Do you recommend that companies explore hiring and building out this ESG controller position?
We're seeing an increase. And so that role could be either a person, and that person is of someone of influence in the organization, or that role could be a team. And that team could be a centralized team. That team could be one person that has indirect reports across the organization and globally. But the going back to the main point of why an ESG controller is there's so much going on around this, on reporting, on different regulations that are out there and moving, with California just almost being finalized. I think we're waiting on the official signature. Having a focused person or team on the regs, on the data, on how to get the information across the organization, and someone that is of influence that can actually drive the process is important kind of capabilities within that ESG controller. And I do think, especially for large multinational global companies, they've either put in that role or are looking into putting in that role.
All right, Dina, you led a fantastic discussion at Amplify on governance and controls within ESG reportings. What were your biggest takeaways from that conversation? And what were some of your favorite moments and insights from the rest of the Amplify conference?
One of the takeaways was we had a room of, I don't know, maybe 50 folks that are all different organizations, all different levels within the organizations, and all different maturity levels of where they are around their ESG sustainability process. And it was really cool hearing from each other as they kind of taught back to the room, but then also a lot of note taking. And it was like, oh, I should incorporate that. Oh, that's a good that. And I was like, oh, all right. Even if those notes get lost on the airplane, the point of writing it down and kind of remembering it and thinking about incorporating means that is actually important to you. So that was really cool seeing. And then for Amplify, Reese Witherspoon. I mean, I am a huge fan of her as an actress. I'm a huge fan of her, in book club. And it was just amazing to see how genuine she was just up on stage. And so that was, and I love the whole Amplify conference and it's great networking and everything, but Reese was my number one takeaway.
Okay, Dina, I do have to ask one off the cuff question. Who would be your top choice as an Amplify keynote speaker next year? Who would it be and who do you want to see take the stage?
Funny you say that. I would love to see Peyton Manning on stage. He ended, especially with Denver, right? And he is from a football player and just kind of he's I think had a lot of influence on people and actually has an amazing story as well. And I'm sure we can incorporate how Peyton Manning, exemplifies, the core values that Workiva also has as well.
Well, this has been fun and great. Dina, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Yeah, no, it's been wonderful, Ernest. Really appreciate chatting with you and, talking more about sustainability, controls, risk, governance, evolution of it. Yeah, thank you.
And to our audience, thank you for joining us for this episode of ESG Talk, brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, ESG, audit, and risk. If you enjoyed this episode today, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to future episodes on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. You can also go to our website to watch sessions from Amplify 2023.